Welcome to NarrativeNook audio tales where enchanted stories come to life. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe, like and share to support our channel. Enjoy listening. Roxanne frowned imperceptibly, not quite sure how she should refute that for a moment. In front of her, Estella grew all the more aggrieved when she didn't only decline the dinner invitation but was also not responding to her father's comment after such a long time. Are you mad at Daddy, Miss Jarvis? She gingerly tugged on Roxanne's sleeve. Jolted out of her thoughts by Estella's voice, Roxanne regarded the little girl before her with mixed emotions. Estella sniffled, feeling utterly miserable. Although she had no idea what Herbscape group Lucian was speaking of, she could tell that the two adults were at odds again. Daddy has finally forgiven Miss Jarvis, but now she is mad at him. At that thought, she lifted her eyes and glowered at her father in aggravation and ire. Meeting her gaze, Lucian put away some of the displeasure on his face and said nothing further. Roxanne was silent for a moment before she patted Estella on the head in consolation. "No, I just don't want to trouble Miss Catalina. It's just a matter of preparing 2 more dishes, so it's no trouble." "I'll go about it right away," Catalina hastily interjected with a smile. At that, Roxanne choked, for she hadn't yet decided to agree and was merely coaxing Estella. Unexpectedly, Archie and Benny's voices had already rung out before she could open her mouth. "It's been ages since we last had your cooking, Miss Catalina. We'd like to eat your signature meatballs." Beaming, Catalina readily agreed. Archie and Benny's remark was tantamount to an acceptance of the dinner invitation. That aside, Catalina had already gone downstairs to prepare dinner. In the end, Roxanne swallowed the demurral on the tip of her tongue and went along with Archie and Benny's decision. Throughout it all, Lucian didn't utter a single word further. However, it was still his house. For that reason, Roxanne got up after deliberating for a long while and murmured, "Sorry for troubling you, Mr. Farwell." Lucian shot her an unfathomable look before he went into his study without saying a word. There was still some time before dinner. Roxanne didn't know what to do, so she played with the 3 children in the room for a while. Only when Catalina came upstairs to call them did she lead the trio downstairs. She initially thought that Lucian wouldn't be eating with them, considering his attitude earlier. To her surprise, the man descended the stairs no sooner had they taken their seats. He sat down across from her. "Miss Catalina's grilled fish is really delicious, Miss Jarvis." Estella took a piece of fish for Roxanne, snapping her back to reality. Smiling, Roxanne thanked her. "Thank you, Essie." Estella flashed her a docile smile in return. Then, she took a piece of fish for Lucian. Inclining his head a fraction, Lucian remained silent. Imitating Estella, Archie and Benny took some food for their mother before timidly glancing at Lucian at the side. Discerning their intention, Lucian reflexively stole a glance at the woman sitting across from him. Thereafter, he quirked his lips at them in assent. In the next second, Archie and Benny took some food for him, one after another. Lucian accepted readily. Roxanne, on the other hand, gaped at her 2 children, the emotions in her eyes turning increasingly complicated. Madeline's question before she stepped foot into the manor earlier echoed in her ears. Could it be that they've really learned about their relationship with Lucian? But even so, their attitudes toward their biological father shouldn't be such. I remember that they were exceedingly averse whenever the topic of their biological father came up. Hence, they wouldn't be treating him so nicely right now. Following that thought, she felt that she was overthinking things. Forcibly suppressing the thoughts running through her mind, she lowered her eyes and started eating. Roxanne didn't want to tarry after dinner, so she took her leave with Archie and Benny. "Can't you play with me for a while longer, Miss Jarvis?" Estella clutched at the hem of her shirt with all the reluctance in the world. Leaning down, Roxanne stroked her head and cajoled gently, "It's late, so I've got to go home." After saying that, she added in a moment of weakness at the sight of Estella's reluctant expression, "I'll come and keep you company another day." She merely wanted to comfort the little girl, but the latter unexpectedly took it seriously. "When will that be?" Estella gazed at her pitifully with solemnity written all over her face. Upon hearing that, Roxanne was inexorably stunned for a while. "When will that be?" On instinct, she lifted her eyes and glanced at the man across from her, telling him with her eyes that she didn't really mean it. In the past, Lucian would speak up and help her defuse the situation. But this time, he acted as though he didn't notice her predicament. In that instant, Roxanne couldn't quite bring herself to tell Estella the truth as she stared into her hopeful gaze. Meanwhile, Estella continued in utter ignorance. "Archie and Benny told me that you often bring them out to have fun. Can I tag along, Miss Jarvis?" Roxanne's eyes flickered and she felt downright conflicted. Alas, Archie and Benny promptly seconded at the side. "Let's go camping together next week. That'll be fun." Back when they were abroad, Roxanne always brought them camping with her colleagues from the Research Institute whenever she was free, and it was incredibly delightful. When Estella heard that, the anticipation within her soared and her eyes shone brightly. As Roxanne looked at her seemingly sparkling eyes, she simply couldn't bring herself to turn her down. "Essie, Miss Jarvis is very busy with work, so she probably has no time." Out of the blue, Lucian's scornful voice drifted into their ears. At his words, Roxanne's pupils constricted. Snapping her eyes up, she glared at the man in front of her with an absurd look in her eyes. "I found it unnecessary to explain his misunderstanding toward me earlier, but I never thought that he'd remember it for so long and even mock me." At that, the light in Estella's eyes dimmed and she dipped her eyes in disappointment. Helplessness deluged Roxanne as she eyed them both. She had no other choice but to suppress the disgruntlement within her and first coax Estella. "I promise I'll bring you camping with Archie and Benny next week." It wasn't until then that Estella raised her head once more. But still skepticism lingered in her eyes. Archie and Benny hurriedly chimed in, "Mommy never lies." Estella had always trusted them unconditionally, so the smile entered her eyes again since they had said as much. Bobbing her head obediently, she held her little finger out at Roxanne. Roxanne was startled for a moment, not quite sure what Estella wanted to do. "A pinky promise," Estella urged in her cute voice. At that, understanding dawned upon Roxanne. She found it rather amusing, yet her heart melted at the same time. A moment later, she held her little finger out and hooked it around Estella's outstretched finger in a pinky promise. Only then did Estella relax completely. "It's late, so I'll be going home with Archie and Benny first. Rest earlier, Essie." Before leaving, Roxanne bid her farewell with a smile. Waving at her obediently, Estella saw them off. Lucian stood behind her silently with a dark and indecipherable gaze as he watched Roxanne, Archie, and Benny disappear into the distance. "Daddy." When Roxanne, Archie, and Benny had disappeared from sight, Estella lifted her eyes and stared at her father. At her voice, Lucian slowly retracted his gaze and lowered his eyes to meet her gaze. "Yes." Puffing up her cheeks, Estella demanded in a huff, "Did you make Miss Jarvis mad again?" Tonight, Miss Jarvis didn't talk much to him. No matter how hard Archie, Benny, and I tried, she hardly glanced in his direction. Following that line of thought, frustration swamped her. He has already promised me that he'd forgive her and never make her mad again, but he didn't keep his word. Discerning her thoughts, Lucian frowned and was just about to answer when he abruptly remembered James' advice in the next heartbeat. Thus he went silent for a few seconds before replying, "We have some conflicts at work." As soon as Estella heard the word conflicts, her face fell. Lucian regarded her with his brows furrowed. "Both of us have to work, so it's inevitable that we have conflicts at work. You must understand that." Nevertheless, Estella scrunched her face in anger. But why must you bring home your conflicts at work? Her question had words eluding Lucian. Could it be that you haven't forgiven Miss Jarvis? Estella was all dubious. When Lucian heard that she was placing the blame on him, his brows creased. Some time passed before his lips twitched cryptically, and he asserted, "You know I never bring work stress home." Blinking hesitantly, Estella solemnly cast her mind back to the past. That seems to be true indeed. He's very busy, but he's still exceedingly patient with me every time he returns home. So, was it Ms. Jarvis who brought work stress home? She couldn't understand why adults couldn't draw a line between work and private life, much less fathom the fact that the person who did so was none other than Roxanne. But even then, she's always in the right. Adamantly siding with Roxanne, she furiously shot daggers at her father. Even so, you've got to coax her. Dumbstruck, Lucian felt utterly exasperated. I've already spelled things out, but she's still siding with Roxanne. Meanwhile, Roxanne hailed a taxi by the roadside and brought Archie and Benny home. She was really exhausted after interacting with Lucian earlier, so she didn't speak much throughout the drive. However, Archie and Benny thought that she was angry at them. Thus they looked at each other guiltily. Benny tugged at Roxanne's shirt pitifully. Mommy. Don't be mad anymore, okay? Hearing that, Roxanne forcefully perked up and met their gazes in puzzlement. We shouldn't have sneaked out and made you worry, Benny whispered in apology with his head penitently hung low. The instant Roxanne heard that, she inexorably recalled Lucian's words earlier. I can understand that they sneaked out, but I really can't fathom why he framed it as a deliberate ploy on my part. At that thought, a headache started assailing her. Conversely, Archie and Benny thought that she was livid, so they gave explanation after explanation. We only went to see Essie because we were really worried about her. Besides, we were afraid that she'd be even sadder when she didn't see you upon waking up, so we wanted to make her happy. Roxanne could tell that the children were getting anxious, so she did her best to suppress her emotions. I'm not mad. In fact, I want to thank you for comforting Essie. Even though the kids' actions did cause a misunderstanding with Lucian, Roxanne knew Estella's mood would not have improved had it not been for them. The children breathed a sigh of relief after hearing their mother but remained somewhat cautious. Sorry, Mommy. We won't run off by ourselves again, promised Archie after crawling into her embrace. Despite how dim the light in the car was, the exhaustion on Roxanne's face was plain to see. The boy was convinced that he did not do anything wrong before, but at that moment, he was filled with guilt. Benny, too, crawled into his mother's arms and apologized. Then, Roxanne gave her children a big hug before patting them on the head. I know you were just worried about Essie. In response, the kids nodded in agreement because they were indeed concerned about Estella. However, they also had another reason they dared not tell Roxanne. On the way home, Roxanne could not help but tense up when she saw from afar that the lights in the mansion were on. After reaching the door, Roxanne was about to ask the children to stay there while she went inside to have a look when someone suddenly turned the doorknob from the other side. You're finally back. Meline felt as if a huge weight had been lifted off her shoulders when she saw the three. After leaving the Farwell residence, she went straight to Roxanne's house and waited for them to return. The truth was that Meline could not stop worrying about the two little ones. Roxanne, too, was relieved to see her best friend at her house, and following that was a burst of emotions. Aunt Meline greeted the boys, puzzled by the woman's appearance since they had no idea what had happened. With a serious face, Meline lowered herself so she could look the boys in the eye. Let me see if you're okay. Only after confirming that the children were not injured in any way did Meline start scolding them. Do you know how worried you made your mother and me this afternoon? You're not to run off again without telling us. Do you understand? If you must, at least inform your mother." The boys did not know their mother had asked Meline to help search for them until they heard that, so they quickly lowered their heads and apologized. "We're sorry, Aunt Meline. We will do that next time." Glaring reproachfully at the two children, Meline uttered, "It's a good thing you had those watches on you. Remember to keep them on always, okay?" To that the kids quickly nodded. Only after scolding the children did Meline rise to look at her friend, whom she could not help worrying about when she saw how exhausted the woman was. "What happened? Are you and Mr. Farwell?" Meline wanted to ask if Roxanne and Lucian had a fight but stopped because she suddenly remembered the two boys were beside her. Knowing what her friend wanted to ask, Roxanne smiled and pretended as if everything was okay. "No. I'm just really tired today." Meline then gave Roxanne a suspicious look but decided not to overthink the situation. After all, searching for and worrying about two lost kids was a taxing affair. Even though Meline had no idea what had happened at the Farwell residence, she was sure it took a lot out of Roxanne. Still, Meline did not ask about it in the end, and since it was already late, she decided to take her leave. Roxanne was drained, so she went to bed early that night. The next morning, Roxanne was woken up by her ringing phone. She then forced her eyes open to check the time and realized there were 10 minutes left before her alarm went off at 7. Wondering what the phone call was about, Roxanne sat up to wake herself further before answering the call. "Oh, what's up, Dr. Galloway?" The research institute is on fire," exclaimed Colby nervously. Roxanne was completely awake the moment she heard that. "Yeah, I'll be right over. Hear me out first. I've already contacted the fire department, so the firefighters are on their way," added Colby. However, Roxanne did not hear that because she had already hung up. After washing up, she rushed to the institute without even putting any makeup on. Roxanne would hate for anything to happen to the medicinal herbs she had just placed there the day before. Now that Herbscape Group has been seized, it'll be difficult to find a medicinal herb supplier again if I lose those medicinal herbs. With that thought in mind, Roxanne anxiously sped up her car. The firefighters were already doing their best to put out the fire when she arrived at the scene. "You're here," she greeted Colby, who hurried over to Roxanne as soon as he saw her. After nodding in response, Roxanne had her eyes fixed on the location on fire. "Oh, what's the situation now? Did they find out what caused the fire?" Not only was the institute filled with many medicinal herbs, but it also had numerous flammable materials. Hence, those working there had always been vigilant with fire prevention efforts. Roxanne had never heard of any fire incident involving the institute, so she wondered how the fire could have started. Colby had a strange look in his eyes before he quickly put his thoughts aside and pretended to be collected. "So we haven't got the time to investigate yet. I came in early today and was surprised to smell something burning inside when I was unlocking the door. The fire was already burning vigorously when I got in, so I quickly called the fire department before calling you." After the explanation, Colby ventured a guess with furrowed eyebrows. "It's probably caused by a misplaced item. I should have checked everything before leaving yesterday." When Roxanne saw how Colby blamed himself for the incident, she suppressed her anxiousness to comfort him. "And it wasn't your fault. After all, nobody could have seen this coming." The fire captain walked out after he and the other firefighters managed to de-escalate the situation, so Roxanne hurriedly approached him. Colby still had more to say, but the woman before him was already gone. Staring blankly at where Roxanne stood, Colby seemed somewhat displeased with his face hardening. "Hey, is the situation serious? Do you know what caused the fire?" questioned Roxanne anxiously, standing before the captain. After wiping the sweat off his face, the captain frowned while shaking his head. "We can't tell just yet. It won't be easy to find the cause since institutes like yours are usually filled with flammable materials. To make things worse, the materials mentioned were already reduced to ashes. Roxanne was disappointed when she heard the reply but thanked the captain anyway. "Thank you for your help." To that, the captain nodded indifferently. "It's our duty." After confirming that the fire was put out and getting the green light from the firemen, Roxanne was finally able to get near the research institute that was engulfed in an inferno. Her heart sank the moment she managed to get a closer look. She had been worried sick all morning, overcome by the apprehension that the medicinal herbs that she had just retrieved the day before were all gone. Alas, her worst nightmare came true. The very store that caught on fire was the one where the medicinal herbs were stored. Not only were the medicinal herbs the batch that they had just retrieved the day before destroyed, but the other medicinal herbs they previously stocked up were also burned to ashes. Fortunately, Colby had managed to call for help in time and managed to stop the fire from spreading to other areas. This is standing beside Roxanne. Colby found himself to be at a loss for words as he stared at the shambles before them. Roxanne let out a soft sigh. Well, luckily no one was hurt, and the fire didn't spread to other areas of the research institute. Colby sighed and said in a defeated manner, "There goes the hard work you guys did yesterday." It took them the whole morning to move all the herbs into the store. Moreover, Colby knew that it must have been difficult for Roxanne and Jack to get the herbs from Herbscape Group in the first place. Roxanne furrowed her brows in response. It would be difficult to get her hands on medicinal herbs of the same quality. Nonetheless, that was the least of her concern right then. She turned to look at Colby and said, "Dr. Galloway, could you please investigate the root cause of the fire at the Research Institute?" If it was due to the flammable nature of the herbs, Roxanne knew there was nothing she could have done to prevent the disaster. However, if someone had deliberately set the place on fire, she knew she had to expel the culprit from the Research Institute. Colby immediately led a group of people to the surveillance room. Meanwhile, Roxanne sought the firemen's help to locate the ignition source. However, they couldn't find anything after looking for quite some time. We seldom encounter cases of research institutes catching on fire. However, more often than not, it is due to inappropriate storage of medicinal herbs, the fireman commented. Perhaps the fire at your research institute is also due to the same reason. Roxanne reckoned that the ignition source must have burned away in the fire under such circumstances. That would explain the reason they couldn't locate the ignition source. Despite feeling that something was off, Roxanne could only nod along doubtfully to the fireman's remarks as she thanked him. The fireman returned to his post afterward. The chief fireman bade goodbye to Roxanne and left with his team. Roxanne and the staff of the Research Institute were left at the entrance of the Research Institute. She remained unconvinced by the fireman's conclusion. However, since they couldn't locate the ignition source, the fireman might be right. Then again, the Research Institute had always been fine, and there were only the usual few types of medicinal herbs in store. The staff in charge of the store were all experienced as well. Thus, Roxanne was baffled by the fact that they would commit a mistake that could lead to a fire at the store. Utterly confounded, Roxanne was overcome with frustration. After some time, she turned around to face the staff who had all been standing behind her with a solemn look on her face. Who was the first one to arrive here in the morning?" she asked. Someone replied in a small voice, "It was Dr. Galloway. He's the one holding the keys, and he's always the first to arrive and unlock the entrance for us every morning." Roxanne frowned slightly, plagued by a gnawing feeling that something was not right. According to the staff, nobody else would have access to the Research Institute even if they arrived first, seeing as only Colby had the keys. Then again, what could be Colby's motif? Moreover, he was the one to report the fire to the authorities. Roxanne found it incredulous that Colby would do something like this. After a moment of contemplation, Roxanne suppressed her suspicion toward Colby and scanned the group of staff in front of her. "Have you guys carried out the scheduled periodic inspections on the herbs and store lately?" she asked. The staff in charge of the inspection last week hurriedly took a step forward. I inspected every single storeroom last week and I've only left after confirming that everything was in order, he replied. Roxanne took a closer look at the man and she recognized him as one of the experienced staff of the Research Institute. Hence she had no doubt of his work ethic. Every staff present knew the inappropriate storage of medicinal herbs could put the entire lab in peril. Hence nobody dared to take the matter lightly. However, if there was indeed no problem with the storage of the herbs as claimed by the staff, why would the store suddenly catch on fire? The more Roxanne thought about it, the more befuddled she was. Hence she merely nodded at the staff's explanation. Now that the fire has been put out, other areas in the Research Institute are now safe. Do proceed to your respective workstations and resume work, she added. Then she turned around and headed for the surveillance room. It would appear as if only the surveillance room had the answer she was looking for. Afraid that Colby might have sensed something, Roxanne hastened her pace. She bumped right into Colby, who was heading out of the surveillance room when she arrived. As the two of them locked gaze with each other, Roxanne's heart sank. Colby was wearing a gloomy expression. It was as if he hadn't found out anything useful from the footage. Did you find out anything? Nonetheless, Roxanne decided to try her luck and asked. Colby frowned and shook his head. I didn't see anything. Roxanne knitted her brows. Oh well, I think it's better for you to see for yourself, Colby replied grimly. Then he led Roxanne into the room. She stood before the control center and tried to access the footage in the morning. The crease between her brows deepened the longer she looked at the footage. There was nothing but black smoke in the footage. It seemed like the store didn't catch on fire just that morning. The fire could have started way earlier in the wee hours of the night. Can we have a look at some earlier footage? Roxanne turned to Colby and asked. He shook his head helplessly. If for unknown reasons the surveillance cameras were down from yesterday afternoon till this morning, he explained. Then Colby started to retrieve the footage. There was nothing but static on the screen. It would appear that the surveillance cameras had indeed malfunctioned. Roxanne felt her heart sank yet again. Even though she trusted the staff and believed that they had no reason to sabotage the Research Institute, it was clear as day that someone had deliberately tampered with the surveillance cameras. After some time, Roxanne nodded at Colby and said, All right. Let's get out of here. Colby nodded and turned off the footage. A cold glint fleeted across his eyes as he watched her leave. When Roxanne turned around to rush him, however, the cold glint in his eyes was gone. Have you found out what happened? He asked. Roxanne kept her eyes low, unable to conceal her distress. No. I have to ask around and find out what happened. Roxanne felt a heavy weight bearing down on her chest as she thought about how she would have her answer very soon. Colby didn't ask further questions and followed her all the way to the research area. In the research area, the researchers had just regained their composure from the fire incident earlier and got back to work. When they saw two people walking in, they stopped what they were doing in unison. With a grim expression, Roxanne swept a glance at everyone and asked, Did anyone come to the Research Institute yesterday afternoon? Coincidentally, the surveillance cameras were down, so Roxanne could only assume that someone had gone over at that time. As soon as those words fell, everyone exchanged glances with each other silently. Yesterday was a Sunday. It was such a good opportunity to rest at home. So why would anyone come to the Research Institute without a reason? Besides, she's asking questions that has something to do with the fire. Even if someone was here, why would they admit it? Suddenly, Roxanne was exuding a fearsome aura as she threw a cold glance at everyone. I have no desire to suspect anyone here, nor can I think of a reason why an employee at the Research Institute would do something like this. However, the truth is that the person responsible for the fire is someone from the inside. Hence, I would like to know who that person is. Please step forward and don't cause the other employees unnecessary trouble." After that, she added coldly, "The fire caused a huge loss to the research institute. When I find out who's responsible, I'll have no choice but to press charges. However, if that person is willing to come forward now, I think there's still room for negotiation." Everyone lowered their heads when they saw the look in her eyes. In an instant, pin-drop silence ensued, and the only sound left was of the boiling liquid in the research area. Ahem. Colby suddenly cleared his throat to defuse the tension in the air. At that precise moment, one of the male employees shuddered. However, Roxanne didn't notice it because she had shifted her attention toward Colby. Colby started slowly. "I've been hiding something from you. After hearing what you said, I think I ought to spill it. This is for the sake of that person." With that, he raised his head and looked at everyone. He spoke softly, but everyone could hear him clearly. The crowd was taken aback when they heard those words. Judging by Colby's tone, it seems like the person responsible is really someone from the research institute. Realizing what those words meant, everyone quickly turned toward the person next to them, wondering if it was really an inside job. Within those few minutes, all the researchers there became on edge. Seeing that, Roxanne's heart sank. However, she suppressed her anger and waited for Colby to continue. "After this, he's most probably going to expose the culprit. I'd like to see just who it was that had done something so heinous to the research institute." Colby cleared his throat once more as if he was giving the culprit the chance to come forward on his own. He then began, "Yesterday afternoon." The moment he started talking, there was a sudden commotion among the employees. Colby's voice trailed away to nothing, and everyone turned to look in the direction of the commotion. "It's me." A scrawny man came forward and stood in front of Roxanne with an apologetic expression. Everyone was dumbfounded when they saw that. Jason. How could that be? Why would Jason do such a thing? He has been working for the Research Institute for almost a decade. He has contributed so much. The employees murmured among themselves. Likewise, Roxanne was in disbelief. "Although I haven't been in the Research Institute for a long time, I know all of them. The man before me is an experienced employee at the Research Institute. Besides, he always seemed like an honest man. He doesn't even look like he's capable of doing something like this. I can't think of a reason for his action." It took a while for Roxanne to think of a reason for Jason Coleman's action. "Dr. Coleman, did you accidentally misplace some medicinal herbs and didn't store them properly? Is that why the fire started?" That was the only reason she could think of. Surprisingly, Jason shook his head and subconsciously looked at the man standing next to Roxanne. Colby looked somber when he met Jason's gaze. "After you guys left yesterday afternoon, I was also getting ready to leave. However, I bumped into Jason. He told me he needed to fetch something from the Research Institute. I didn't think so much about it, so I let him in. I only locked the door after he came out." In other words, Colby was telling everyone that he didn't know what Jason was doing after he went inside. Roxanne was still in shock, so she merely nodded absent-mindedly. Colby could tell she was still in shock. With a glimmer of darkness flashing across his eyes, he asked Jason on her behalf, "What did you do after you came in?" Jason lowered his head guiltily and uttered apologetically, He couldn't finish his sentence. It was as if he was utterly ashamed of his actions. A while later, he uttered through his gritted teeth, "I'm so sorry, Dr. Jarvis." He had basically admitted his crime with that sentence. Finally, Roxanne managed to calm herself down. She then clenched her fists and asked, "Why did you do it?" At that point, what Jason did the day before didn't matter to Roxanne anymore. After all, the storage was filled with flammable substances. For a researcher who was an expert in chemicals, setting the storage ablaze was child's play. Therefore, she just wanted to know what drove Jason to do things that would destroy the Research Institute. Jason heaved a sigh and answered, "I needed the money. Roxanne furrowed her brows when she heard that. Jason sounded extremely helpless when he said, My son is sick, so I need a lot of money. My salary for working at the research institute isn't enough. So, Roxanne finally understood what was going on. Someone found out Jason's son was sick, and that person offered him money to do such a thing. At that thought, Roxanne clenched her fists even tighter. Who is it? Who told you to do it? Everyone in the research institute knew Jason's son was sick. Outsiders, on the other hand, wouldn't know unless they investigated Jason. Roxanne was afraid that someone in the research institute was responsible for offering Jason the money. Jason shook his head and whipped out his phone from his white coat. I don't know who, but that person sent me an email. As he was saying that, he tapped on his phone and showed the email to Roxanne. Roxanne looked at the email and saw a few simple sentences. The sender told Jason to do it in exchange for a huge sum of money so that Jason could help his son get treatment. Obviously, the sender told Jason to set fire to the storage room. You did it because you received this email? Roxanne was so angry that her voice was trembling. Dr. Coleman, you know me. If you need money for your son's treatment, you can always come to me. I'm a mother, too. Did you think I would sit back and do nothing to help you? If necessary, I would even find the best doctor to treat your son. Why did you have to do something so foolish? Jason was regretting what he did dearly. In fact, he regretted it the moment he did it the day before. However, Colby had already locked the research institute up, so he couldn't salvage the situation, even if he wanted to. That morning, he made the effort to arrive at the research institute to see if there was anything he could do to fix it. However, he was wrong when he thought he had arrived early enough. By the time he arrived at the entrance, the firefighters were already at the scene. Jason couldn't help but slap himself twice across the face when he recalled the burnt storage and what Roxanne had said. This is my fault, Dr. Jarvis. I'm so stupid. Utterly embarrassed, he asked, Since I've come forward on my own, could you please let the matter slide? My son is still in the hospital. Roxanne dug her fingers into her palms to force herself to stay calm. That's not up to me, Dr. Coleman. This matter is being investigated by the police. Jason, how could you be so foolish? Colby chimed in. Upon hearing that, Jason became flustered. I was wrong. I'll return the money. Dr. Jarvis, for my son's sake, please let it slide. I promise I won't commit the same mistake again. Roxanne stared at the person in front of her blankly and went silent. I have children, so I know how Jason feels. Having said that, it doesn't mean I should forgive him. Tell me who told you to do it. I can write a memorandum of understanding on behalf of the Research Institute. As for your son, I'll also lend a hand, Roxanne uttered indifferently. Jason's gaze dimmed when he heard that. In the end, he had no choice but to give in. That's all I know. As you can see, the sender sent the email without a name. I don't know who sent it to me. Indeed, he took the risk solely because he was tempted by the money offered. Roxanne frowned and took a photo of the sender's email address. After that, she sent it to Benny to see if he could do something about it. Meanwhile, the police arrived at the scene. Jason turned himself in before the police even said anything. It was me. Soon, the police put a pair of handcuffs on Jason and walked him to the police car. With a complicated expression, Roxanne was watching Jason from behind. Dr. Jarvis, could you please help my son? Before stepping into the police car, Jason suddenly turned around to look at Roxanne. Roxanne sighed and agreed to it. Seeing that, Jason cooperated with the police and stepped into the police car. The people at the Research Institute were all feeling melancholic as they watched the police cars drive away. Roxanne suppressed her disappointment and turned toward the crowd. I don't want something similar to happen again. Since you are all working with me, please come to me if you need anything. I'll help you guys the best I can. I don't wish to see any of you sacrificing the Research Institute in return for personal benefits ever again. The crowd acknowledged her words and felt sympathetic toward Jason. There are so many reputable doctors in the Research Institute, but instead of looking for any one of them for help, Jason resorted to crooked ways. With Jason gone, Roxanne assigned his ongoing work to the other researchers before walking back to her office tiredly. Concerned, Colby followed her from behind. Dr. Jarvis. Roxanne only noticed there was someone behind her when she wanted to close the door. Is there anything else? She asked in confusion. Yesterday was a tough day for me, and I had just gone through something disastrous this morning. I really don't have much energy left in me to deal with anything else. Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.